Hey, what's up everyone? I've got two Z series wide angles with me today. I've got the 14-30 f4 and the 14-24 f2.8. Now, I want to do a landscape photography comparison and see, is there a clear best option between these two lenses? Now, I've shot with the 14-30 for almost 3 years and I love the lens. I mean, there are aspects of this lens that you cannot find anywhere else. But the 14-24 is Nikon's pro grade wide angle offering. So like I said, I want to do a showdown. I want to see which of these lenses performs better. Maybe there won't be a clear winner, but I want to see if there is, and at the very end I want to make a verdict. You know, what's better? What should I go with as a landscape photographer? The 14-30 or the 14-24? So we're going to look at build quality, we'll do some sharpness comparisons, we'll look at some sun stars, and at the very end, you know, we'll come back with all of that data and see, you know, can we make a decision on one of these two lenses? I think the first thing to cover is price. So the 14-30 is $1,300 new and the 14-24 is $2,400 new. Now that's an $1,000 price difference and that's considerable. So I think it's important to keep that difference in mind as we kind of walk through these comparisons. Now you can find each of these lenses at a cheaper price used or refurbished, but you're still looking at around $800 to $1,000 you know, between these two lenses. And like I said, that's definitely something to consider. Okay, so let's start with build quality and we'll start with the 14-30. Now, I wouldn't say the 14-30 has exceptional build quality, but I want to start with the pros. And I think the biggest thing for this lens is the size and weight. It is absolutely insane how small and lightweight this lens is for what it offers, which is 14 millimeters on the wide end to 30 millimeters. Now it's a relatively simple design. I mean, you have an autofocus to manual switch, you have a control ring for manual focus, and then you have the zoom ring. Very, very simple. I will say the weather sealing on this lens is fantastic. I've been drenched in the rain, I've been hit with salt water. 3 years later, it's still going. So again, relatively simple. It does take filters though. It takes 82 millimeter threaded filters. It's just another amazing innovation by Nikon. I mean, to get 14 millimeters in this size and weight, but into a package that also takes 82 millimeter threaded filters, I mean, that's absolutely incredible. And it makes this lens very unique because Sony offers nothing in this class that is this small, is this lightweight, and can also take threaded filters. Canon does have the 14-35, but the initial reviews on that lens aren't great. We just have to kind of wait and see what happens with that. This lens though, I can vouch for it, and I've shot with all the systems. This is absolutely an amazing lens for what it offers. There's nothing special about the build quality, but I think the big things, the size and weight and the fact that it takes filters. Now an important thing when we're doing this comparison is when you do adjust the zoom ring, the barrel does extend. So here's at 14, it extends to 30 as well. You can collapse it though, you know, to put in your pack or when you're not using it. Okay, let's look at the 14-24. Again, this is a pro grade lens from Nikon and the build is pro grade. It just feels better. The construction just seems better. And there's a couple of unique things that we get with this lens. We get an OLED display. Now that display can show things like focus distance, it can show you your aperture, your focal length. It also has a function button and you can customize that function button to various features. I assign it to depth of field preview, and that really helps me when I'm doing something like shooting sun stars because I can simulate an exposure preview at the aperture I'm shooting at. And by doing that, say if I'm at like f16 or f22, I'm moving the lens around, I can actually see exactly what my sun star is going to look like. There's a control ring. You can program that to a bunch of different things. I have it set on aperture right now, and then you have the zoom ring. Now you can see as I'm moving the zoom ring, everything's happening internally. So if I had to guess, the weather sealing is just a little bit better on this lens. Now, I've had a fantastic experience with the 14-30, but because of the internal mechanisms here, I'm going to say it's just a little bit better on the sealing end. Now, there's also an autofocus to manual switch, so we have that carryover. But like I said, overall the build quality is just a little bit better with this. It's a pro grade lens and it feels and looks like it. Now this is a very interesting design. We have a little bit of a bulbous front element, But Nikon has taken a very interesting approach with this, and they actually have included this hood. Now, this hood attaches onto the front of this lens and other Z series lenses, but the hood allows for threadable filters. They're a little bit unique. They're 112 millimeter filters, so that's a little bit larger than, our traditional size. Usually 82 is the largest we see. But this lens does take, or this hood I should say, takes 112 millimeter filters. You can attach this hood, and now we have a filter system for this lens that's not really big and bulky. So I think huge pros of these two lenses is the fact that they can take threadable filters. Again, it's really hard to find 14 millimeters on the wide end, and also 14 millimeter lenses that take filters. You can't find it with Sony. They have a 14 to 24, a 14 millimeter prime. Those both need filter attachment systems. You do have the 15 to 35 and the 14 to 35 from Canon. The 15 takes filters, but it doesn't give you 14. The 14 to 35 does take threaded filters as well, but again, the performance hasn't been great in all the initial reviews and things I've read about this lens. So overall, I think the build quality is excellent for these two lenses. They're sealed, they feel great. The 14 to 24 is definitely more pro grade. I think the biggest things are the size and weight, and the fact that they take filters. Now you can see that the size difference. The 14 to 24 is bigger. It's longer. It also is about just under a ½ pound heavier. But what's interesting is I really don't feel that ½ pound. The 14 to 24 is really lightweight for what it is, which is a 14 to 24 with a max aperture of f2.8. It's really lightweight. I think the main difference is the length. That the 14 to 30 packs a little bit easier into a bag, into an ICU, etc. But this lens of 14 to 24, I would not call this a bulky, heavy lens. I think it's extremely compact and lightweight for what you get. So let's look into optical performance now. And I think one important thing to note before we start is there's definitely a trade-off between these two lenses. The 14 to 30 is f4, that's the max aperture. The 14 to 24 is f2.8, but it only goes to 24, right? It's 14 to 24. This lens, we give up that extra stop of light, f2.8 to f4, but we get an extra 6 millimeters. We get that 14 to 30. So I think that's a really hard thing to consider. What makes more sense? Does 14 to 30 at f4 make more sense, or does that limited zoom of 14 to 24 make more sense, but we get that added f2.8? Okay, so I want to do some sharpness comparisons. So I want to measure these lenses up against each other at 14, at 20, and at 24. So I'm going to go take some shots, and we'll jump into Lightroom, and we'll kind of do a side-by-side comparison and see, is there a clear winner? I'm especially interested to see what happens in the center of the frame, but also the corners, because if there's one thing I've noticed using the 14 to 30 is the corners tend to be just a little bit soft, but I'm really, really impressed with the sharpness of the 14 to 30. So can the 14-24 match it or surpass it? I really hope so for the price, but let's do some testing and actually see.
Here in Wisconsin, my favorite thing to test lenses is buildings and architecture. There's usually a lot of detail going on, so we're going to use a building to test out these two lenses. I've got the 14 to 24 on the left, the 14 to 30 on the right. Now I find for landscape photography that these lenses resolve really well from f11 to f16. In that range, depth of field and frame-to-frame sharpness is maximized. So at 14, 20, and 24, I've taken shots at f11 and f16. So let's start at 14 millimeters at f11. And again, the 14 to 24 is on the left, the 14 to 30 is on the right. So let's zoom in here. And just a note, I am zooming in to 200%. So this is pretty much dead center. And if we compare left to right, there are minor color differences. These were shot with the same white balance and all the same settings. Now, I think, in my opinion, the 14 to 24 is just a little bit sharper, but you can see the 14 to 30 is doing exceptionally well. I am zoomed into 200%. zoomed out, it's really hard to say if one or the other has better quality. Zoomed in though, it looks like the 14 to 24, especially around this area, is a little bit sharper. Now if we look to the edges here, we can see the 14 to 24 is starting to outperform the 14 to 30. If we look at these two trees here, they definitely have much more detail. They're sharper versus the 14 to 30. 14 to 30 is still doing really well though, close to the edge. But you can see once we get really to, we get really close to the edge over there, we are getting better performance with the 14 to 24. Let's look at the other side. And looks to be similar. You can see there's just much more detail here. You can see these leaves are sharp, lots of softness here, even in the car here. And if we look in a little bit, honestly, it's very, very close. And we can look at the bottom corners here as well. Looks like maybe 14 to 24, just a little bit better. So at 14, I think that the 14 to 24 is winning, but I think it's very close. So I think the center sharpness is very, very similar. Maybe a little bit better on the 14 to 24, but it's not better by a large amount. Now the edges look definitely better with the 14 to 24. Okay, let's move on to f16. I'll zoom in here. Now at f16, the 14 to 24 is definitely looking better. And this is an aperture that we shoot at a lot as landscape photographers, right? Because we're maximizing that depth of field. f16, much better here. And we're even seeing better performance with the 14 to 24 as we scoot in a little bit from the edge too. If you look at this telephone pole here, it's definitely sharper, more detail. Let's look at the other edge. So it looks like at f16 we're getting much better performance with the 14 to 24 pretty much across the frame. And we just check the center again. Yeah, so 14 to 24 definitely impressive at f16. And like I said, this is an aperture that we use a lot as landscape photographers. You know, when we're including foregrounds and we want to maximize depth of field, f16 is important. And we can see much better performance with the 14 to 24. Okay, moving on to 20 millimeters. These are at f11. And I'm definitely seeing better sharpness with the 14 to 24. Edges, definitely looking better with 14 to 24. And you can just see much more detail with the in the trees here. Here's f16 at 20 millimeters. And much better in the center with the 14 to 24. Much better on the edge. You can just see more detail, more sharpness with a 14 to 24 pretty much across the frame. So really impressive. I mean, again, I'm zoomed into 200% here. I think these differences, are obviously exaggerated at 200%. I think if we zoomed out a little bit, it would be a little bit harder to spot these differences, but you cannot deny what we're seeing with the 14 to 24. It's just, it looks to be a super sharp lens frame to frame. This is at 24 millimeters f11. And we're getting much better performance from the 14 to 24. But I mean, the 14 to 30 is still extremely impressive. We're just seeing a little bit better sharpness pretty much in every area of the frame. This is interesting. It almost looks, here at 24 in the corners, the 14 to 30 almost looks a little bit better. And I would say that it is, or they're very, very close. So that's interesting. But I think at 24 at f11, center sharpness and in the edges still goes to the 14 to 24. This is at 24 millimeters at f16. And at f16, much better performance with the 14 to 24 in the center. And the edges are looking a little bit more defined, but it's pretty close. You know, if we just look right here, you see more detail, a little bit more detail with a 14 to 24, especially in the brick here. And again, I think maybe at 24 that the corners of both these lenses are very similar, with maybe the edge going to the 14 to 30. So it's hard to say, but the 14 to 24 is definitely impressive. Now, you might notice the frames are a little bit different, right? These are both shot at 24. But you can see there's a little difference in the perspective we're actually getting. And I think that's due to a few things. One, on the 14 to 24, I do have that LED, so I can dial right into 24 where I don't, you know, there's no way for me to tell where I'm at with the 14 to 30. You know, I might be at like 24.5 or something like that. And I think the other thing is both of these lenses are getting digital corrections applied, and we can't change those corrections. So I've actually found that when shooting, like the 14 on the 14 to 30 is a little bit different. I actually think it's a little wider than the 14 to 24, both of these lenses at 14. So I think that's interesting. Overall, though, I think that the 14 to 24 is performing better overall. You know, with a wide angle like this, we're more likely to shoot on those wider spectrums, like 14, like 20, and I think we saw much better results across the frame from f11 to f16. You can't deny the 14 to 30 performance, though. It's $1,000 less. It was a little bit softer in the center, but it's very close. You can see the edges were much better on the 14 to 24. But for that price point, the size, I mean, it's really, the optical quality we're getting from the 14 to 30 is very impressive. Let's look at the sun stars from both these lenses now. Now, I find the sun star to be an important aspect of a lens. As a landscape photographer, I shoot into the sun all the time. And if you're able to add a sun star to your composition, I just feel like it adds impact and it makes the image more dynamic. So let's look at both these lenses. I did these test shots at 14 millimeters, and I went from f8 up to f22. So this is the 14 to 24. This is at f8. This is at f11, f16, f22. Now, a couple things that I notice. This is a pretty good sun star. You're going to see when we compare to the 14 to 30, I prefer this sun star. Now, I think with both these lenses, you have to shoot at f22. I just much prefer the result at f22 versus like f8 and f11. Now, on the old 14 to 24, the f mount, I found that like f8 to f16 produced the best sun star. And I preferred that sun star over these newer versions. But I do like the definition in the sun rays here. I like how they are still very thin. We've got nice points. I think the other thing to point out, and you'll notice this with the 14 to 32, the flare control is excellent. You don't see any flare in the corners. You have a little bit maybe in the center of the frame below the sun, but I've used both these lenses and shot directly into the sun and gotten no flare, or I've had to clean up no flare in post. You know, usually on other lenses, like a lot of Sony lenses, the Canon 15 to 35, I need to do the finger trick where I block out the sun and that removes the flare. Don't have to do that with these lenses. The coating is amazing. Okay, let's look at the 14 to 30 now. So this is at f8, f11, f/16, f/22. Now, the biggest thing I see between these two lenses is the 14 to 30 has a sun star that kind of radiates outwards, and I just don't like it. I think that the weakest element of the 14 to 30 is the sun star. You'll notice how the rays from the sun, they radiate. You know, they start thin and they get wider and wider. I prefer a much, more defined ray that actually either maintains its width, or it starts at the sun and it gets thinner and thinner and comes to a point. That's kind of what we see from those iconic Canon lenses. And I just don't like this look. But if we compare the 14 to 24 on the left to the 14 to 30 on the right, you definitely see a little bit more definition in the star, and I prefer it much better than the 14 to 30. Like I said, I think the downside is to get the best star from both these lenses, you have to shoot at f/22, and the image quality does suffer. I mean, there is much more softness across the frame at f/22. So I recommend when you're shooting a sun star in either of these lenses to blend. I recommend taking an exposure at like f/11 to f/16, taking your sun star at f/22 and blending them, blending those two exposures so you have a sharp landscape but also the nice sun star. So again, sun stars are subjective. I give this one to the 14 to 24. I like the the greater definition in the sun rays.
So I hope you guys enjoyed the video. After doing this video, I'm not even sure which one is better. I mean, I think what Nikon has done is absolutely amazing. These are both great lenses. There's just one or two things that separate them and make them unique, right? It makes the decision really difficult. Let me know in the comments if you're still struggling. I've struggled through it for almost a year now. I'm really excited to move forward with the 14 to 24. I just think optically this is just a beast of a lens, and it's just still very lightweight. You get filters, so I'm just really excited to kind of test this out on some future trips. But let me know, let me know in the comments, what'd you end up going with? I have a lot of friends who went with the 14 to 30. I mean, it's hard to deny what that lens offers. Who knows if this is the right decision for me? I think it is, at least. But anyways, guys, thanks. Take care out there. I hope you guys get good light, and we'll see you in the next one.